and welcome to IDP IELTS Expert Talk, where we discuss frequently asked questions straight from the experts. I'm Payal Chandra, and today we have with us Mr. Andrew Steele, who is an IELTS expert with more than 30 years of experience in English language teaching and teacher training in the UK, Middle East and Asia. He has worked extensively in India, Nepal and other countries in South Asia as well. Welcome to our show, Andrew.
Thank you for inviting me.
So please share your experience of being a part of IELTS for more than 30 years.
Well, in fact, I started working with IELTS in Cairo, in Egypt, in the mid-1990s, where I was responsible for administrative aspects of the exam and also some teaching. I then moved on to become an IELTS teacher trainer and more recently an IELTS examiner. In fact, I was working for IDP in Kathmandu, Nepal, until May this year as an IELTS examiner. I've recently stopped doing that so I can go back to IELTS teacher training.
That's interesting. What do you think makes IELTS really unique?
Well, I think there are a number of things which differentiate IELTS from the other English language exams out there. First of all, I think that it's very convenient, especially with this new computer-based IELTS test that's available. It's very easy for candidates to book the date that they want and get the time that they want for the IELTS exam. I think IELTS is better at that than the other English language exams available. Also, it's an international exam and it allows candidates to assess their level of English based on a global standard. Also, IELTS is extremely reliable. The University of Cambridge Assessment is constantly conducting research into the IELTS exam and improving it and making changes to ensure that it's a really reliable measure of a candidate's English.
Right. So now let's discuss some questions that we keep getting from our candidates and every now and then. So I'll start with some generic questions first and then we'll move on to some section-wise discussion. How does that sound?
That sounds great, Payal. Thank you.
Okay. So generic question number 1. What are the key things that a candidate need to take care of while preparing for IELTS?
Well, I think before they even start preparing, they need to make sure that their expectations are not too high. Preparing for IELTS isn't going to necessarily improve a candidate's level of English very much. When preparing for IELTS, the candidate will be learning about exam technique and how to use their current level of English to their best advantage during the exam. They can't expect to enter an IELTS preparation course that lasts for 4 weeks, for example, at a band 5, and then come out the other end at a band 8. It's simply not going to happen. So expectations should be realistic. However, when preparing for IELTS, I think the most important things to know about are certainly the band descriptors, the public band descriptors, which are available on IDP's excellent website, IELTSessentials.com. Also, the question types that are going to come up in each paper, and candidates should have a strategy for addressing those different question types.
So Andrew, my next question to you is, what differentiates a 7.5 band scorer from a 6.5 band scorer?
I think all of the obvious things like someone at 7.5 would be more fluent, they'd have better vocabulary, they'd have more accurate grammar, and they'd have perhaps better pronunciation also than someone who scored 6.5. For the specifics, I would refer candidates again to the IDP IELTS Essentials website, where they can find the public band descriptors. In these public band descriptors, there's a clear description of what a candidate needs to do in each of those 4 criteria that I just mentioned in order to get a 6 or a 7 or an 8. If someone scores 7.5, that's a combination of band score 8 for some of the elements and band score 7 for others of the elements. So candidates who want to know what these things mean, 6.5, 7.5, I'd recommend that they looked at IELTSessentials.com and find the public band descriptors, which explain everything fully.
Oh, that's helpful. So which is better according to you, a computer-delivered IELTS or a paper-based IELTS?
Well, I don't think there's a question of better or worse. I think they're slightly different. The things which are not different, I should say, is the exam itself. Whether it's computer-based or paper-based, the actual test is exactly the same. What is different with the computer-based IELTS is that it's easier to book, there are more dates available, and it offers candidates more flexibility. So candidates who only have a limited window in which they can take their IELTS test should maybe look towards the computer-based IELTS, which is becoming more and more popular.
So what's the difference between academic and GT and their test format?
Okay, so academic training or general training are the two different modules that a candidate can take for IELTS. Generally, academic training is used for candidates who wish to go and study at a university in an English-speaking country, whereas general training is used for candidates, skilled workers usually, who want to go and work abroad. Some of the papers are exactly the same, the listening, for example, the speaking, for example, and the other two are different. Writing task 1 is very different between the academic test and the general training test. General training candidates need to write a letter, whereas academic candidates need to write a short report about a bar graph or a line graph or something similar. Also, the reading is different. The academic reading and the general training reading are marked slightly differently, and information about that can again be found on IELTSessentials.com.
My next question to you, Andrew, is if a candidate decides to appear for IELTS again, can he do that?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, a candidate can appear for the IELTS test as many times as they like. There's no restriction. If a candidate wanted to take an IELTS test every Saturday for the coming 2 months, there's nothing to stop them from doing that.
All right. So what happens if a candidate is not satisfied with his or her test scores?
Well, hopefully, because all examiners for speaking and writing examine to standard, hopefully that's not going to happen very often. But if a candidate really doesn't think that the test score reflects their level of English, they can apply to any IDP office for a remark. IDP will charge a fee for this. The candidate's exam will then be assessed by a senior examiner or possibly even someone from Cambridge Assessment in the UK.
Okay. All right. So now let's move to the questions specific to writing section. So my first question to you is how to score 8+ in IELTS writing section?
Well, that's quite a difficult task, and the first thing, the candidate has to have an 8+ level of English, which they need to combine with exam technique. So what I'm going to talk about is the exam technique, things that a candidate would need to do in the writing exam in order to get a band score of 8 or above. The first thing is that the candidate needs to fully answer the question in an essay, a task 2 essay, for example. All parts of the question must be addressed, and the candidate must extend all of the points they make, giving relevant examples and listing things from their own experience and their own ideas. They also need clear paragraphing, and each of those paragraphs should have a good topic sentence, which is then expanded on in the main body. In terms of vocabulary, the candidate has to show an awareness of fairly high-level vocabulary, and they need to use that quite accurately. They need to use a range of natural expressions in order to get an 8+. Similarly, for grammar, the candidate has to show that they can use a range of complex grammatical structures and that they can use them very accurately. Having said that, even at a band 8, a candidate is permitted to make a few errors. All of this is available in the public band descriptors, which are, as I said earlier, on the IDP IELTS Essentials website.
How to prepare IELTS writing in 7 days?
Well, that's a big ask, and I think candidates who really do only have 7 days to prepare need to do a lot. First of all, I would recommend really familiarizing themselves with the format of the writing test. One good resource for this might be these Cambridge IELTS practice test books, which are available through IDP. So do as many of these as possible, really familiarize themselves with the different essay types that are likely to come up during the writing task, both task 1 and task 2. And also, I think, as much online practice as possible. IELTS Essentials is a good place to find this sort of practice material. So familiarize themselves with the format of the test, familiarize themselves with the type of question that's going to come up, and then do as much practice as possible by looking at IELTSessentials.com.
Right. What are the most common question types in task 1?
In task 1, we have 2 different question types, one for the academic paper and one for the general training paper. The general training task 1 is always going to be a letter. It might be a formal letter, a semi-formal letter, or an informal letter, a letter to a friend. Those are the only 3 question types that will come up in general training task 1. In academic task 1, on the other hand, there are a wider range of question types. These usually focus on a graph, or a chart, or a table, or possibly a flowchart, or a process diagram, or some other graphic. Candidates will be asked to identify the main trends and to highlight the most important data. It's very important that candidates remember to include all of the data presented when they're answering academic writing task 1. Moving on to task 2. For both the general training module and the academic module, the essay that the candidate will be asked to write is more or less exactly the same. These essays will be asking candidates to present their opinions, maybe to evaluate and even criticize or challenge an opinion presented in the question. They may be asked if they agree or disagree with something and to provide evidence for that. Or they may be asked to suggest a solution to a problem. In any case, it's going to take the form of an academic essay for which there should be a good introduction, some good main points, and a good conclusion in order to get a high band score. Examples of the sort of essay types that come up can be found on IELTSessentials.com.
For task 2, essay, how do you write an introduction?
Well, I think one of the most important things that needs to be in the introduction to a task 2 essay is evidence of the writer's point of view. And that point of view should be clear, not only in the introduction, but all the way through the essay to the conclusion. Other things that I would recommend in the introduction to a task 2 essay are an explanation of where the essay is going to go, what the writer's going to write about. And this they should do by paraphrasing some of the words in the question. All of those things, I think, are good tips for getting a high score in the task 2 essay.
What would you suggest words that can be avoided in IELTS writing?
I don't think there's really any words that should be avoided. I think it's important to remember that there are no magic formulas, things you should do or things you shouldn't do, words you should use, words you shouldn't use for IELTS, because everything is assessed globally rather than looking at specific words. So no words that you shouldn't avoid, but obviously the wider the range of vocabulary that the candidate is able to display in their writing, the higher the band score they're going to get. But no specific words to avoid.
Okay. And how to put examples in your essay?
Well, I think it's good to have examples in your essay. Higher band scores are given to candidates who are able to extend their points with examples. Now, these examples can be from your own experience, they can be from your own body of general knowledge, or they can be something that you've just made up. We're not really concerned about what those examples are. What we're concerned about is that the points a writer makes have been extended and examples are a good way of doing that, regardless as to what type of examples the writer chooses to use.
Right. Thank you, Andrew, for finishing up with the writing section. That was a lot of information. I'm sure a lot of students will benefit out of it.
It's a pleasure.
So moving on to the reading section. How can a candidate get Band 8 in IELTS reading?
Okay, so it's slightly different here for the academic module and the general training module. For the academic module, a candidate needs to score between 35 or 36 out of 40 in order to get a Band 8. Whereas for the general training module, they have to score 37 or 38 out of 40 in order to get a Band 8. So as you can see, there's a slight difference between the scores there. They certainly need to have the basic reading skills of skimming and scanning, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in order to get a good score in the IELTS reading.
What are the common mistakes to avoid in IELTS reading section?
Well, I think there are two main ones. First of all, trying to read every word of every text in the reading section. There simply isn't enough time. That's why it's important for candidates to master the skills of skim reading and scanning. Skim reading enables candidates to look quickly at a text and get a general idea of what it's all about. This will help them to answer all of the questions. Scan reading helps students to zero in on a particular point of the text, which they can then read more closely to find the correct answer. So the most common mistake, I would say, number one, is trying to read the whole thing. The second mistake, I would say, is not reading closely enough. Common modifying expressions like some of, or many of, or most of, are put in as distractors to make the questions more difficult to get right. So when the candidate has identified the part of the text that they need to read more closely, really reading it very closely and being aware of nuances of meaning which may affect the answer to the question.
How to complete IELTS reading on time, and how many types of questions are there in IELTS reading?
Okay, well, let me deal with them one by one. In order to complete the reading within the time limit, as I just said, candidates must not try to read every single word of every single text. Skimming and scanning, as I said previously, are the skills which are needed here, and only by mastering those skills will candidates be able to get information from a text in a very short period of time. How many types of questions are there? Well, I think the last count I did, there are about 14 different types of question. And although all 14 won't necessarily come in one paper, any of them could be presented to the candidate. So they need to have an awareness of these 14 different types of question. Information about those 14 types of question can again be found on IELTSessentials.com. I think there's too many of them to go into that amount of detail right now, though.
Right. So how to solve filling the blanks question in IELTS reading?
Okay, so there are several types of fill in the blanks. You might be asked to complete a sentence, you might be asked to add words to a summary, anything like that. So first of all, the candidate needs to use these scanning skills. They need to find the part of the reading text which contains the correct answer. Before they do that, they might have a look at the question and try to identify the type of word they're being asked to provide. It might be a noun, it might be a verb, it might be an adjective. If candidates know what type of word it is first, before they start scanning the text, this will make the process of scanning much quicker. Also, candidates should be aware that any words that they need to fill into blanks will always have correct grammar. So by being able to identify what the grammar is for that blank, that's going to help candidates as well. That will give them clues as to what type of words are expected to be inserted into the blank spaces. And finally, don't forget, how many words are they being asked for? Is it 1 word, 2 words, 3 words? They need to get that right.
So I think we are done with the reading section, and thank you for so much information on this, Andrew. So let's move on to our next section, which is listening section. My question to you is, how can a candidate get 8.5 band in IELTS listening?
Okay, so again, that's quite a big ask to get an 8.5. They need to get either 37 or 38 out of 40 on the listening test in order to get an 8.5, which obviously is the vast majority of the questions. In order to do that, a candidate needs to be comfortable with listening to a wide range of English-speaking accents. These could be from England or Scotland or Australia or New Zealand or possibly even India or Jamaica, where English is spoken as the mother tongue. Also, a candidate needs to be able to listen and extract information.
So how to improve focus on listening?
Well, I think one big tip that I'd like to share with your viewers is that it's very important that if you miss something in the IELTS listening test, that you don't focus on that you focus on what is currently happening on the recording. If you spend too much time thinking about an answer you've missed, you're going to miss several answers that come after. So it's very important not to worry about answers that you've missed. Also, candidates need to be able to listen for key words. Now, fortunately, English is a stress-timed language, which means that speakers in the listening text will generally put extra emphasis on the words which are important. And these are usually the words that candidates need to hear in order to get the answer. So, focusing on those stressed words, those content words, and not worrying too much about little grammar words like and or do or the is a good tip for being able to interpret those listening recordings more easily.
All right, Andrew. So my next question is, how long is the IELTS listening test?
Well, the academic module and the general training module listening are exactly the same. The tape script goes on for about 30 minutes, so 30 minutes of recording, and candidates will have a further 10 minutes at the end of the test to transfer their answers onto the IELTS answer sheet.
How many questions are there in IELTS listening, and can we write in capital letters in IELTS listening?
Okay, so I'll deal with them one by one. There are 40 questions in total in the IELTS listening test. And if candidates want to write all in capital letters on the answer sheet, why not? Maybe it's a good idea, in fact, because say, for example, an answer to one of the questions in the listening test was Paris, the capital of France. If a candidate wrote that with a small p rather than with a capital P, they'd be penalized for that. If they use all capital letters, there's no chance of that happening. So capital letters might be a good idea. It means that candidates won't be penalized for missing out a capital letter when a capital letter is necessary.
Well, that's something really, really useful. Can a candidate take notes during the test?
Yes, the candidate will have the listening paper, which contains all of the questions. He or she can make as many notes on that as he or she likes. They'll then get 10 minutes to transfer those answers and those notes onto the answer sheet. They may not make notes on the answer sheet, but on the listening paper itself, candidates can write what they want.
All right. So we are done with our listening section questions, and now we will move on to the speaking section questions. Andrew.
Okay.
My first question to you is, how can a candidate get 9 bands in IELTS speaking?
Well, in order to get a band 9, and again I'd refer back to these band descriptors that are available on IELTSessentials.com, the public band descriptors, and they describe the language features both in terms of fluency and coherence, vocabulary, grammar and pronunciation that a candidate needs in order to get a band 9. A band 9 basically means that the candidate's performance in the IELTS speaking test is equivalent to that we could expect from an educated native speaker of English. So as you can imagine, very, very few, possibly no grammar mistakes, a wide range of natural and colloquial idiomatic vocabulary, the ability to speak at length without any hesitation or repetition, and really easy to understand in terms of accent and pronunciation. It's quite difficult to get a band 9, but not impossible. And as I said, a band 9 reflects the sort of language that would be used by an educated native speaker of English.
So how can a candidate introduce himself in IELTS speaking test?
The candidate doesn't really need to think of anything special to do in order to introduce themselves, because the examiner will ask the candidate before the speaking test actually begins to state his or her name. At that point, the candidate can state his or her name, so that makes an introduction unnecessary.
Is there any dress code for IELTS speaking?
No, absolutely not. You can wear what you want.
Does accent matter in IELTS?
Yes and no. If the candidate has a strong accent, that's not a problem per se. It's only a problem if it affects their ability to be understood. If a candidate has a strong accent and they're very clear and easy to understand, and they have an appropriate rhythm to their speech, and they use intonation well, and they pronounce individual sounds correctly, they could have a strong accent and get a band 8 or an 8.5. However, if the accent and the rhythm of the speech make it difficult to understand the candidate at times, this will push the band score down. So accent is only a problem if it affects the candidate's ability to be understood.
All right, so what are the topics asked in IELTS speaking? Is there any specific format?
Well, there are a variety of topics, and these are constantly changing. Always there are 2 sets of speaking materials that are live at any one time. So 2 sets of speaking materials that are being used by examiners globally. And these are changed a couple of times a year. Basically, in part 1 of the test, the topics will be general. They might be about going to the cinema. They might be about drinking tea or coffee. They might be about the type of music you like. In part 2 and 3 of the test, first of all, the candidate will be asked to talk about a topic which is listed on a cue card. These again will be very general topics. They're not going to be testing the candidate's general knowledge or specific knowledge about any one topic. They should be topics that anyone could talk about. A time you went on holiday, for example. Your ideal job, for example. So things that anyone should be able to talk about. The candidate will need to talk at length during part 2 for 1 to 2 minutes. And in part 3, the examiner will ask questions which extend the topic that was covered in part 2. As the candidate goes through part 3, the questions will become less and less about familiar personal things, such as your immediate circumstances, your family, your life, and become more abstract and global. So candidates should be prepared to give more abstract, global answers during part 3 of the test.
Moving on to our next question, Andrew. How IELTS speaking test is marked and what needs to be avoided while taking the test?
Well, the IELTS speaking test, the candidate gets to meet a real-life examiner, which I think, going back to an earlier question, is another one of the unique things about IELTS. The candidate will be assessed by a real-life examiner, and that examiner will use 4 assessment criteria, each of which are worth an equal number of marks. First of all, the candidate will be assessed on their fluency and coherence. And this is basically about their ability to keep going and to make perfect sense while they keep going. They're also being assessed on their ability to use discourse markers, such as moreover, whenever, firstly, secondly, connectors of that kind. That's the first category. The second category of assessment on the speaking test is lexical resource. This simply means vocabulary. How appropriate is the candidate's vocabulary? How wide a vocabulary does the candidate have? And how accurate are the words that they're using? The third category that's assessed is grammatical range and accuracy. In order to get a good score on the speaking test, a candidate will need to use both simple and complex grammatical structures. And the wider the range of structures that are used accurately, the higher the score. Also, a candidate needs to be in control of the number of errors that they make during the speaking test. And in general, for the higher band scores, very few errors are allowed, especially for a band 8 or a band 9. The final criteria on which the candidate is assessed during the speaking test is pronunciation. We spoke a little bit about this before when we talked about accent. Good pronunciation is all about having the right rhythm, using intonation and stress to add meaning to what the candidate is saying, and of course, pronouncing individual sounds correctly. In answer to the second part of your question, is there anything that should be avoided? There's nothing I can particularly think about. Candidates should try to take a few deep breaths before they go into the examination room and to just wait for the examiner to tell them what to do. The examiner will make it quite clear what the candidate needs to do in the speaking test. So there's no need to ask too many questions. One good tip, I think, is to not speak too quickly. This can affect pronunciation and intelligibility, and also it can make the candidate sound nervous and unprepared. So a good medium pace with a bit of variety, maybe speeding up a bit sometimes and slowing down a bit sometimes, I think is good advice.
I think that was really, really informative, Andrew. So let's move on to our next question, which is how long is the speaking test in IELTS?
Well, the speaking test can be anything from 11 minutes to 14 minutes. Part 1 of the speaking test is a minimum of 4 minutes and a maximum of 5 minutes, whereas Part 2 is a minimum of 3 minutes and a maximum of 4 minutes. Part 3, on the other hand, is similar to Part 1, between 4 and 5 minutes long. Now, the examiner will encourage the candidate to say as much as possible, so hopefully the majority of speaking tests will be around 13.5 to 14 minutes, but it could be a bit shorter if the candidate doesn't produce as much language.
All right. So my next question to you is, what are the best recommended methods for practicing speaking test?
Well, I think practice, either individually. A good idea is for candidates to record themselves and then listen back and have a look at those public band descriptors to see where they fit. Also, working with a friend or a colleague who's also studying or preparing for IELTS and carrying out mini speaking tests, which you could do at home or anywhere. That would be a useful way to prepare. Also, familiarizing yourself with the format of the speaking test. And that information, along with some example speaking test questions and practice activities, can be found on IELTSessentials.com.
So, any closing notes, Andrew, that you would like to share with our candidates in terms of how to prepare for IELTS on a daily basis in terms of time management?
Well, in terms of time management, I think candidates need to allow themselves enough time to prepare in relation to the band score that they want to give and what their current level of English is. Because don't forget, attending an IELTS preparation course will give you lots of good exam technique, but it's not going to significantly improve your overall level of English. Candidates should be aware that starting from a band 4, for example, if that candidate wants to move up to a band 5, that's going to take roughly 120 hours of study. So they need to have realistic expectations. I would say then, once they're confident that their English language level is up to the mark in terms of the band score they want to get, take a good IELTS preparation course. These are available online, I'm sure at a variety of institutes all over India, and also Cambridge University Press published some excellent materials that candidates could use at home. These also come with an online component. So I think the biggest thing is don't rush. Be aware of what your current band score might be. Are you a lower intermediate user, a mid-intermediate user, an upper intermediate user? And then think about, is that enough to get the band score I want? If it's not, candidates need to do some work to improve their English and then maybe take an IELTS preparation course. So I think being realistic about what they can expect to score is a big part of keeping the candidate happy when taking an IELTS test.
Well, I'm sure that our audience will really benefit from today's show. And thank you, Andrew, for such a detailed answer for each and every question today.
Well, thank you very much to IDP India for inviting me, and good luck to all the IDP candidates who are going to be taking IELTS in the near future.
Guys, hope you enjoyed the discussion, and that's all from our end. Please do check out the details in the description, visit our website and social media pages, and leave your feedback. It has been a pleasure hosting the IDP IELTS Expert Talk. I am your host, Payal, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.